Sorry about the wait, everybody. I'm Jonathan. This is Quixel's community manager speaking. With me today, I have Jack McKelvie. He is one of our 3D artists who has created the urban alley in front of you today. This is an incredible piece of work, very, very detailed, completely baked lighting too. None of this is dynamic, right, Jack?
Yeah, that is correct. No RTX, all baked lighting.
No RTX, so no memery for us today, I see.
Yeah.
With that being said, Jack's going to cover some great subjects today. You guys, as always, feel free to ask any questions in the chat. I will take any that I can. And from this point on, I'm going to turn it over to Jack and let him take over.
Cool. Thank you. So the first thing I kind of wanted to cover with you guys is just the wall material, because the wall material is a little complex, and we did provide that as a downloadable file that you guys can grab anytime, but it's a little complex and hard to use, so I wanted to go over just how to use it basically. And you're noticing here some of these light maps are freaking out sometimes, so forgive that. All right, so here's the material, and I just want to go over some of the basic parameters. The performance of this material can vary a lot, and one of the easiest ways to get some of that performance back, because what this is actually doing is it's blending between 3 different texture sets, and that can get really expensive with parallax materials. So if I just come up here, perhaps, yeah, something like right up here. Down here, where we have min and max steps, what we can do is we can actually change those to go down, because for this scene I had it set really high in order to get some really nice renders out of it, but it's really not necessary to have it so high. So you can always change the steps here, and I have it for the base parallax, the red channel, and the green channel as well. So just wanted to make sure that we cover that. And there's a bunch of other things in here that you can change as well. There's other little quirks, like if you look under the input textures, you actually have a base blend mask, and you can either use a height map like you might traditionally use for something like this, or you can also use a modified mask. And that's what I did here. Is for this I wanted something a little bit more obvious in how the mask was blending, because this is a height-based blend, so I wanted a bit more crisp transitions. So I made some modifications to the height map there. Now the next thing I wanted to talk about with this material is it is a Vertex paint material. So if I just come over here, and I'm actually going to ruin my light bake here by doing this, but if I just go into like the red channel right here, I can start painting and removing stuff. And with that, basically these walls, they need a certain amount of vertices in order to actually calculate this data. As you can see, like when I paint, it's really defined by how dense the mesh is. So if you're not getting enough detail to your blends, and you're wondering like why that might be, why the transitions are, you know, kind of just a little bit less defined than what you want, then it might be because your mesh is just not dense enough. And I can actually pull open my mesh here, and we can take a look at it real quick. So I just go into wireframe. You can kind of see what it looks like here. It's not a hugely dense mesh. It's only about 2,000 triangles, but for something like this, that's kind of exactly what we want. We want enough detail to be able to paint where we want to paint. And yeah.
You know, when you talked about density, one of my favorite sayings is from Polycount, which is so simple and beautiful when it comes to this sort of thing. It's just add more geo.
Yeah, sometimes that helps. Just add more geo. Nowadays, we don't really have really strict hardware restrictions for geometry. Usually, we're facing more issues with shaders and texture resolution, stuff like that. If you want to add some more polys for, just, sticking some bricks in here, for example, kind of like what I did down here, that's totally fine. That just adds more detail and it's not going to hit performance too hard. And the next thing I wanted to talk about with you guys is I know we've covered this in previous streams, but decals. Decals are huge for an environment like this. The Vertex Blend shader does a lot of the work. It does help a lot, but it doesn't quite get all the detail that you need. And if I just like unhide all of the other stuff in the scene, you can see how many decals I have placed throughout here. I just have tons and tons of decals, and they're not super expensive either, so go crazy, go crazy with decals. And I can just kind of move these around and just see like how much it adds. Like even just here you can see how much it adds. You have any other questions for me?
I think we're good for the moment. But in
Cool.
regards to decals, yeah, they're absolutely an integral part of modern workflows in Unreal. They definitely add so much to it.
Definitely. Like even here, if you just like, even this is just like a super small detail, but it adds so much, just having a bit of leakages from some of the stuff that's attached to the wall. Because like in the real world, everything that's attached to a wall, water is going to drain in a certain way. Mold is going to grow in a certain way. References are critical for something like that. And basically, you find references, see what happens in the real world, and try and replicate that, because that's going to take you a long, long ways.
So we got a question from Lost with Dan. He'd like to know how long it took you to create this, like the scene itself and the decal placement and the cinematic rendering aspect of it.
Right. This scene took, oh man, it's hard to say for sure how long this scene took. I want to say it took around 300 hours or so, maybe a little bit more. For this scene, we did a lot of back and forth and feedback, and there was a lot of questions where we were going to take this scene. So initially, like you can see actually in my breakdown video that I did, that it started off very differently than what it actually became. And basically, it took a while, but if I were to kind of optimize that workflow and kind of race to the finish line, so to speak, it would have taken a lot less time than 320 hours. It probably would have taken like 100 hours. And if I had to make all this by scratch, that would have been crazy amount of hours, like probably like 1,000 hours or something like that. All that stuff just takes so much time to make. And these wires, I was just thinking about these. These wires are actually using Unreal Engine 4's wire plugin thing. I just kind of wanted like physics wires, because I thought it might be kind of fun at some point. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with wind for the scene, and if it was going to be a bit more open. So I wanted to be open to the possibility of having some physics in the scene. And all I have on these guys is just a tiling rubber material. And if I get in like real close, you can kind of see what's happening here. And if I move it, that's when the fun happens. Ooh. So I won't, well, let's see. The wall, I'm trying to think. Sorry about this, I'm having a brain fart. Yeah, so these wires are all physics-based, just in the plugin, but this wire is actually modeled. I actually created a set for these guys. I wanted to make sure to get these guys just like sort of like the pipe set. I created a modular set that would just kind of stick together, and so I could build around that. And speaking of pipes, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about that. They're pretty simple, and I can go ahead and pull up Maya here. I have all the pipes right here. So what I did was I knew I'd be using a lot of pipes for the scene, and I wanted to just have a certain set of pipes to work with. So I just kind of spread these out real quick. So I have just like a short pipe, a long pipe, a corner, and a valve. And I figured that was probably enough to get the job done. And I didn't want to spend too much time on the pipes. I wanted to not like go through the baking and texturing workflow. I wanted to make sure to keep it really fast and simple, and so I could iterate. So I did a really simple pipe and UV'd it in a way that tried to hide the seams as best as possible. I also beveled some of the edges and corrected the Vertex Normals. I just have a script that, you grab these center faces and it points the normals up. So if I just go into face normals, you can kind of see how they're just pointing up like they should. And then you just smooth the whole thing, and you got something that looks sort of like it was baked, and you don't have those ugly harsh edges that you don't need. The other thing that I did for these is I wanted to create some leakage decals, and I knew I wouldn't be able to use Unreal's decal system for this because it only has a planar projection. So I could project it here, but it gets to the side, it starts stretching, and nobody wants that. So what I did was I just created some shells for these, and I did cover it briefly in the breakdown, but I'll show it again. All you really need to do is actually, let me just bring this back real quick. You can just delete all the extra, and then you have these faces that are these interior faces that are intersecting with what you have, and you don't really want that, but what you can do is you can just transform the component and pull that out a little bit, so you're not going to get any Z fighting when you project the decal here. And if I go back to Unreal, I can kind of show you guys what that would look like. Find one. There we go. So let's see. There we go. So you can kind of see how the leakages are coming down here. And the nice thing about this is you can also rotate it and whatnot. So you can get an angle that you really like. And that's independent of the pipe as well. So you can select the pipe and you can rotate that. It adds a lot of variation to the scene, and allowed me to just very quickly make it look like it's not all the same pipe. And it was basically good enough. Do we have any more questions, Jonathan?
We have some,
Okay.
if you'd like to answer. One of the questions we have from Polynominal. He would like to know what some of the plugins are that you've used in this scene, aside from the wire plugin you talked about.
Right. The only... I don't think I actually used any other plugins for this. I wanted to keep this super vanilla and just keep it basic Unreal. I didn't really want to do anything too fancy. I don't have an RTX card, so I wanted to get really good lighting, so I had to bake it. I didn't really use any other plugins besides the cable plugin, and that was only because it was kind of faster to use the cable plugin. So yeah, no no plugins for me.
So pretty much a vanilla scene with the wires.
Yep, exactly.
Nice. Very nice.
Yeah.
We actually did have another question I would like to bring up in regards to how you made the stone arch in the background.
Oh yes, the stone arch. So this was actually pretty basic, to be honest. The bricks here are just individual bricks. You can see the scene freaking out, but that's fine. I had a couple bricks brought in from Megascans, of course, and what I did was I just manually placed each one and just started bringing it up and all the way around. And you know, it's not the best workflow, but it got the job done. And if I had to do it like regularly, I might do something like 3ds Max or something for like that, and so I could use a bend modifier more easily than in Maya. But it worked for this scene. So if I actually just like click through these, you can see how they're each individually placed for this. And I did something similar over here, and it looks a bit janky because unfortunately with the parallax occlusion mapping, when you jam bricks into that surface, it's going to try and self-shadow those bricks, right? So if you look at it really closely, you can kind of see how they're intersecting, and it's not quite working out. But luckily, you know, from back here, it looks right. But once you get up here, it's just, it's not quite, you know, not quite what you thought it was. So hopefully that answered that question.
I think so.
Yeah.
So we do actually have another one, the water on the ground. I'm going to assume that you did that probably through Mixer, but if you'd like to walk us through how you did it.
Yeah, actually the water was pretty easy. This is a part of the shader that we are giving away. And basically I can go into the Vertex paint, and if you go into the blue channel, excuse that, you can actually paint water. And there's a lot of different functionality for this as well. You can see that there's some waves and stuff like that. You can actually crank that up and make it a little bit more intense if you want to. Alternatively, you can also reduce this a little bit, and so it's not quite as intense. You know, stuff like that. I also have a simple plane. Whoa. Sorry about that. I have a simple plane here that also is a water plane. So if I move that up and down, you can kind of see how that's intersecting with the ground geo.
That's pretty sweet. It seems like the audience agrees too.
Yeah, it's actually a very simple material. If I just open this up real quick, it's just a color depth fade and translucent. I wanted some screen space reflections on there so it looks, you know, consistent and really nice. And then I also I also have a surface translucency volume on there. All the other ones didn't look quite as good, so yeah, that turned out pretty nicely, I think. So yeah, there's I think we provided 2 materials. This is the tessellation based material, and this is pretty fun. I think I didn't even use this this layer, but yeah. And it's all height based blending as well. So if you have like a specific texture that you want to use, like for these cobblestones, it was really important that the water actually come up between the cracks, you know, and like actually come up based on the height. So making that was like a huge part for me, because that just it sells the ground material, and for that matter it really sells the walls too. Like you can kind of
So we
see
got a
how.
couple of questions from chat, Jack.
Yeah. Shoot.
Number one, D20. Actually, I'm sorry. Lost with Dan would like to know what the best decal is that you're using to essentially fill in a lot of these areas, and perhaps maybe we can kind of segue that into how the brick on the floor, like the cobblestone, has been worked with. Like, is that using displacement in any capacity, or are you just using the height map to drive the material?
Yeah, sure. So to answer the first question, I think this is Victor's favorite as well. But if I can click it, yeah, it's this one. So if I open this one up, this guy's my favorite. Yeah, so you can kind of see it here. It's a really versatile decal that I love this decal because I'm using it everywhere. Like you can put it here and it sort of looks like, the water's caused some damage where the wall's like kind of falling apart, but it hasn't completely fallen apart. Like there's still brick underneath. It's just not destroyed enough to see it. And then for like these corners and whatnot, it's so good. It's so good. It ties everything together really, really, really well. And I don't think there's anything else. And I'm using it down here too, and kind of just suggesting that there's some rubble that has fallen off from this. And yeah, that's definitely my favorite decal for sure. And to answer your second question, the ground, it is using tessellation and displacement. If I get super, super close, you can kind of see how it's lifting up. What's built into the base material is distance-based tessellation. I don't have it here, but what it'll actually do is it'll control tessellation so it only appears right in front of you. It's a very good little optimization. I can open this up. Maybe I can show.
Yeah, that definitely looks really good. While you're, I don't want to distract too much from what you're doing, but we do have a request to look at some of the trim sheets that you've made too, if you'd like to talk about that.
Yeah, so the trim sheets, I think it's a bit glorified to call them a trim sheet, but I did make one specifically for the decals. And let's see if I can take a look at that real quick. It's not that one. Although I did make this one so it was tileable. You can kind of see how it just tiles across the top. Pretty simple overall. Yeah, this is maybe a bit better of an example. And it's just, there's a gap there, so it technically tiles horizontally. And that was good enough for these pipes because you don't need it tiling horizontally. There's no reason for that. It's just yeah, you can have it tile horizontally, and so you can just like rotate this around and find the angle that you like for a specific pipe, and then you're good. But
What about some of the brick trim sheets? I think some of the users would like to see those too.
Brick trim sheets. I don't know that there's really a brick trim sheet per se. I have what I'm using is I'm using a tileable brick wall material basically right in here. You can kind of see that happening here. And then I have a bunch of bricks that I imported. And I think I have 3. Yeah, so I'm cycling between 3 different bricks. And if these light maps would stop messing with me, it'd be great. But you can kind of see how I just alternate the bricks around, and that's what gives it so much variety. Because if you don't have those bricks there, it just looks really, really, really flat and not so good.
Something to note for the audience too, something when you bake lighting in Unreal is if you adjust anything that's been light mapped, it will automatically destroy that light map unless you undo action previously. So there's nothing really wrong with the scene. It's just this is a consequence of baked lighting. which is one of the reasons why many artists prefer to create dynamic lights, because you can show off anything and you don't have to worry about it just turning black randomly like that. But
Exactly. Thanks for pointing that out, because that's exactly what's happening. Is every time I do something, it's like, oh, now it's broken.
so let me assume that the barrels and the door and all that's from the library, isn't it? That's just fantastic. I love how it all just kind of just meshes together into this really. Best way to describe it is dank scene. This is just really dank, and I wouldn't call it oppressive. It just, I don't know. This is like a place that I would go and maybe go meet like a spy in the middle of the night or something, just get some secret documents.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because that's one of my thoughts for this scene. Is just like I wanted it to be like really wet, really kind of just sickly. I didn't want it like if you went there, you'd probably catch a cold, or it just. I just wanted it to feel like really kind of dank, depressing, a little oppressive, that kind of thing. And pretty much
Oh, I'm so sorry to cut you off there. I was
No
going to say,
worries.
why don't we go over the lighting in your scene too? As somebody who loves lighting and especially has this weird obsession with like sodium vapor lamps, which is what those orange lamps are in the background, what made you decide that you would put the foreground as a whitish color instead of an orange one?
Well, it was actually a really tricky process to figure this out, because if you saw some of my earlier screenshots, the background was originally sort of a lot more blue, and then it kind of went orange in the center and white in the foreground. And it took a lot of experimenting to get that right, because you're layering all these colors on top of one another. Just considering the colors alone, you're layering a lot of different colors on top of one another, and they're not in different parts of the scene. They're practically stacked on top of each other. So it was really hard to find a balance that didn't just make it look like mud. So like the back here, I actually decided to kind of bring that down a lot. So it's cool, like it's a cool color, but it's not blue anymore really. It's just kind of a nice cool color, and then it fades into this really warm, warm color. And here, I wanted the whole scene to be a little bit more monochromatic. I didn't want it to be like a really colorful light to illuminate this area. I wanted this to be just the light that illuminates the scene overall. And if I pull back even a little further, these have a little bit of warmth to them, but not nearly as much as this scene, or this part of the scene over here. And originally, at the time, I was thinking about wanting to do physically accurate lighting, setting up the lamps to have the proper lumen values and stuff like that. And I don't remember why, but I didn't. But that turned out quite okay. And basically, what I did was I just started adjusting them to basically just fit the scene well, anyways. And so I have like this light here that helps illuminate inside of this light. And basically all the settings here, they're all pretty simple. I just changed the intensity units to lumens, and so I knew where their physical accuracy was. I also adjusted the volumetric scattering. I can actually show what that does, but that controls how much it scatters from the volumetric fog. And that took quite a bit of tweaking as well. So if I just change that back to 4. So that's kind of what I liked on this light. If you get kind of under it, it gets a little weird, but from back here it looks fine. I'll also talk about my light mask settings real quick, because I feel like that's probably the most important part of the lighting. These are my final light mask settings, and to be honest, it could actually be better. Like I could have done a more accurate lighting bake, but between time constraints and quality that I was getting from a higher bake, it just wasn't really worth it. I was already getting really good results, and I didn't really want to, I guess, just waste time. So I adjusted all these settings to kind of fit exactly what I need. The indirect lighting bounces, wanted to max those out. You can actually go higher on a lot of these settings if you just put in a manual number. So if you wanted to like drag that number way up, you can do that. But this is kind of what I decided on. I also do like using Ies Profiles. Excuse me, can't speak. I don't know if I have one on this guy, but this is the only one that I actually wanted it on. Let me double check. Yes, so I do. I actually have it disabled, but if I enable it, you can kind of see what happens here. IES profiles are great. I love them. I don't think it was working for the scene for me. Like I tried like 20 or 30 different IES profiles and it just didn't really work for me. So I decided to just not have it enabled for this.
So, Jack, I've got a question from the audience. Oh, wow. I just had a brain fart. Sorry about that. So Byron wants to know, did you do a general color overlay to balance the scene, or is that the original color of the barrels, floor debris, and the other meshes?
Most of these are pretty original, but everything does have a little bit of adjustment to it. Like if I just open this up. Yeah, so this one's just default. Most of these assets are default. I usually, when using scanned assets, I usually try and keep the color profiles pretty much what they are, and then I just adjust them, like adjust the lighting and adjust the post-processing and stuff like that to get what I really need. The one exception to that is a lot of the rubble that I have. If I can actually, yeah, if I can grab it. This actually needed quite a bit of adjustment because it just wasn't really meant for a scene like this. So I needed to bring down the values a lot and add a kind of a tan color to make it actually fit in the scene.
I would say that's probably a consequence of sometimes working with scans. Not that they're not designed to work with particular scenes like this one, right? But more that when you scan something, you're scanning it as it existed at that point in time, regardless of its environmental conditions, right? So if you went to Nevada and you scanned a bunch of rubble that's in a dry, pretty much dead climate of nothing but arid, hot air, it's not going to have that wet look that you're going to want, or the level of wear that would come from fluid constantly moving over it. So sometimes you're going to have to take these assets, as Jack did, and then think about maybe that the reason why this doesn't visually work isn't because you can't work with scans, but so much that the way it was scanned, you need to adapt that particular asset so that it does look like it comes from the environment you're trying to create.
Exactly. And yeah, there's really nothing wrong with changing the color values and whatnot. It's not really making it any less physically accurate, and it makes it look like it fits in your scene. So go for it, do whatever tweaks you need to make in order to make it look good. That's one of the artistic freedoms we have as artists, is to make those judgment calls as to whether we need to make those changes or not. And I was just looking at this wall again. I just wanted to cover this one more time. Like, let me see if I can do this real quick for you guys, because let's see, what is this called? Wow, that's a not great name. Let me see if I can do this. I just want to hide these bricks for you guys real quick, because I can. It's so enlightening to see just how much worse it looks with no bricks there. Oops. There we go. Okay, so I use mostly that brick. I just hide all these. And these two.
In the meantime, Jack, while we wait for you to fix that out, one thing I wanted to mention too, in relation to physically based values, as artists, part of our job is to observe the world, and sometimes the way people see things doesn't always match up with the way computer algorithms see things. So if somebody tells you that something is not physically accurate, but it looks good, and pretty much everybody you show it to says it looks good, you should probably go with what looks best. Now, if you're trying to go for a super accurate simulation of a particular material, then sure, make sure that all the values are 100% accurate. But if it runs in a way that it just ends up making the material pop as though humans would look at it, rather than what a computer scan would tell you that it should look like, absolutely just go for making it look correct to your eyes. Now, there's some things that you shouldn't do. Like, try not to go above 70% in terms of like whiteness on a or value in general, because that tends to reflect more light than it receives, which breaks the laws of physics. So unless you're really trying to do that, go for it. But in general, like, there's nothing really wrong with adjusting these things until they look visually correct. PBR is a set of guidelines, not strict rules.
Yeah, that's spot on. Exactly. It's exactly that. They're guidelines to help you, and they're just that. So if you have a good justification for doing what you're doing, then by all means go for it. Now I've finally figured out how to get rid of these bricks, but you can kind of see just how much worse that looks than before. And these UVs, they don't even match up or anything, I was able to cover up these really awful seams by just layering in bricks, and that just helped a ton.
Oh, definitely. And that just really shows that Jack has taken like his artistic vision, his eyesight, and just looked at these things and realized this needed more. Maybe a brick wall wouldn't have protruding bricks at the end of it like that, but because it just looks better, it was worth doing. Am I right?
Exactly. That's exactly right. Like, it might not be super realistic, it's not something that necessarily happens, but it looks so much better that it's like, hey, might as well do it.
Oh yeah.
So now that we kind of covered the wall and the bricks, unless there's any other questions, I think I'm going to move on to talking about some of the detailing phases and what I did there to add all this small detail to the scene. One of the first things I did was this material here. I knew I needed some junk in there, and so one of these channels, I believe it's actually the red channel, if I paint, yes, so maybe, or is it the green channel? Well, it's one of these channels. Basically, I can paint this stuff, so if you're looking over here, all this kind of garbage detail that just kind of acts as almost like a noisy material. I filled in all these corners, and that's one of the things I wanted to consider with this environment is creating really nice detail gradients. And what I like to do is I like to start off with my much larger details against a wall. So if I'm looking over here, I have like all this large rubble against the wall, and slowly as it gets closer to the front of the scene, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and noisier, and then it fades out to a much more clean look. And this at least in my opinion, this really helped kind of draw the viewer's eye to where I wanted it to be. So you get this nice path going on that leads the viewer's eye exactly where I wanted it to. And to get a bit more granular, there is one thing I wanted to cover as well as this little material here. This is actually a really nifty trick that I learned a while back from Unreal Tournament. As you can see, this is like blending with the floor really nicely. And it doesn't work for everything, but if you are like me and like to have those kinds of blends, I just added a dither temporal AA and then multiplying that against a constant value. And what that'll do is that'll allow you to control the blend distance. And that's a really nice little feature that I use like almost in every environment that I do.
Unreal Tournament, huh, Jack? Kind of showing your age there, aren't you?
Well, not exactly, because it was Unreal Tournament 4.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, at one point I was digging through their files because, you know, Epic's environments, they look amazing. So I was digging through the files and I found some snow that they had that was blending really well with the terrain. And I was like, how are they doing this? So I opened it up and saw that, and I was like, okay, so that I'm using that.
Not a bad idea. You know, what I was thinking about this for a while. Wouldn't it work to use a depth-based blend on some of these assets as well, or is that probably out of like not a good idea?
Well, depth-based blending used to be a thing in Unreal Engine 3, and you can still do it in Unreal Engine 4, but there's some downsides to it. The first downside with that is you have to use a translucent material on your object. And that would be fine, but it does change the shading a lot. So it doesn't look correct anymore. So it doesn't look like a regular surface. It almost looks like glass or plastic or something like that.
Right.
And unfortunately, the depth fade node actually can't be used on a material that isn't translucent. So this has been a big problem for a long time. And once I found that temporal anti-aliasing node, I was over the wall with joy, because I used to use depth fade all the time for junk and stuff that I'd put into corners in Unreal Engine 3.
So what you're telling me is that you could actually use the temporal aliasing solution to work with some 3D assets and kind of push them into each other without a visible seam.
Yeah, exactly. And if I'm looking at some of these guys, I'm actually using that on this material as well, I think. If I open up the standard master material. Nope. Okay, I'm not using it, but it totally could be used on that, and it would look very nice. Another thing
based on the ground, it definitely looks good.
Yeah, and another thing you can do is if you want to get really tricky and get into like some shader stuff, one really cool thing that I did a long time ago for large assets is you can actually reference distance fields in your material and then use that to drive where the blend is happening. And so, like, you know, you have a mesh that's sticking out of the ground and say it's really tall. You don't want the top of it to blend. You just want the bottom. You can reference the distance fields in order to tell where that blend is going to happen. Now, go ahead.
I hate to cut you short there, Jack, but I think we have something that we want to tease for next week, and I think you have it.
Oh, really? We want to do the tease?
Well, it's getting close to the end of our assigned time here, and I don't want to hold up everybody forever. And we did start a little late, but we're at that point where I think we might want to show that little thing off.
For sure, I think people are going to be really stoked about it. Victor's been working really hard on it, and we're going to be when are we going to be showing it off?
Next Friday. Actually, no, that's the live stream. Next Wednesday, I would hope. Maybe a little earlier.
Okay, well, it's a little teaser, so I'm going to bring it over and show y'all.
And don't quote me on that.
Oh no, I can't bring it over. Okay, there we go.
Killing me, Jack.
There we go. There's the surprise.
Maximize that.
Maximize it. Okay. Okay.
That is so gross.
Yeah. No, I'm just I'm like totally absorbed by watching this right now.
Telling you, man, that Victor, what a guy. The stuff that he comes up with.
What a cool guy. What a so talented. So talented. Always excited to see his next piece of art.
Oh yeah. So, like I said, I think we're getting to the end here, so we should probably start fielding some more questions from the audience.
Yeah.
Maybe you know this. I'm technically not minded when it comes to the engine, but not to the point where I could probably comfortably field some of these questions. Casey would like to know how expensive using a distance field blend compared to using a dither blend would be, if you know.
It's very expensive. Using distance fields in general can be a little expensive, depending on the hardware you're shooting for. And that's what it really depends on is, like, if you're going for console hardware, you're probably not going to use distance fields at all unless you're really stylized, like something like Fortnite. Alternatively, if you're shooting for high-end PC enthusiasts, your goals are going to be a lot different, right? So for something like that, you might do that, but that's one of the reasons why I actually don't use it, is because distance fields, or referencing distance fields in the material, at least last time I did it, was very expensive, and it really wasn't worth the expense. Whereas just using the dither temporal AA, that's really cheap, really easy. It's almost cheap. I don't know for sure if it's cheaper than a translucent material, but it's at least comparable to something like that. And so, I use that literally all the time.
That's great. To add a little bit to that too, whenever I make environments that feature foliage, and you don't really have a lot of that in the scene, but I find distance fields to be completely necessary to make foliage look good, because it tends to be tough to get that volume of ambient occlusion that you would need to see within the leaves for it to actually look believable without using distance fields. So it's kind of a trade-off, right?
It is.
So we do have another question. Lost with Dan would like to know if you wouldn't mind going through some of the steps that you did to create the cinematic shots.
Yeah, so for the cinematic shots, that's definitely a big breakdown in and of itself. But for the cinematic shots, what I did, at least initially, was I wanted to first, make my camera something cinematic. I think it was like 37.86, I think. Something like that. It was around that number. And I wanted to basically just go around and start finding some really good angles in the very beginning when I was first doing my block out. And this is really something you should have planned out as early as possible, because it's a lot of work to set up the cinematic shots and to do your sequencer stuff and record video, and even doing screenshots was a bit of a challenge for this project, because with this project I basically started learning a lot more about color grading and stuff like that, and how my original screenshot should basically have a balanced histogram, and then I was taking HDR screenshots and then turning them into LDR screenshots, and then doing a color grade on top of that. So it was a very challenging process for me, because I've never really done that before, and I wasn't really familiar with the process. But the most important thing is just plan early, figure this stuff out in the blockout phase, because it's going to save your life down the road.
So I guess to add on to Jack's point, you should look at what he's talking about as though he's describing any other process in the design, right? So when you when you go to draw, you're drawing the large shapes first, and then you move into the smaller shapes and into the detail. When you do the sculpting, you do the same thing. When you do cinematics, it's basically the same thing. You block it out, and then you get more fine detailed until the very end. It just gives you more control of the end result, I'd say.
Exactly. Stay in that blockout phase for as long as possible, because the longer you stay there, the more you're going to start to realize, oh, I have issues here, and it's really easy to fix it when you don't have a lot of small granular details that you need to remove and then add back to it. That's a huge time sink. But if you can get it right through the blockout phase, it's going to save you a lot of time, and it's going to save you a lot of blood, sweat, and tears for making fixes. So, is there any other questions?
We do have one. Beltran, I hope I'm not butchering your name. I apologize if I am. He would like to know if you did make any assets just for this environment. I'm assuming the plastic bags are something you made yourself.
Actually, yeah, that is one thing I made myself. The other thing, of course, is the pipe set, which we already talked about a little bit. The plastic bags are, let me just double check by looking around. Yeah, I believe the plastic bags and actually this little lamp up here, these two things are the only other assets that I made myself. And the plastic bag, that was pretty simple. All I did was I used Marvelous Designer to make a quick plastic bag, and it's kind of ridiculously high poly for what it is. It's like 21,000 tries, but going into it, I knew it didn't need to be optimized. I knew 21,000 would be fine for something like this. If it was a bigger environment, I would have baked it down and cleaned up the topology and whatnot. But for these purposes, it was fine for me.
I have to say, I'm getting a kick out of the fact that you used clothing design to create a trash bag.
I do that all the time. Marvelous Designer is one of my favorite programs. It's so easy to do cloth simulations, and before it's like doing cloth sims in Maya. Oh man, I'd rather do UVs all day. I'd rather do retopologizing all day than deal with a cloth sim in Maya. It's just awful.
Yeah, and here I am thinking I would just rather model this in Max, but then realizing maybe it might be a better idea to let the simulator handle the work.
Yeah, where I can, I try and automate that stuff. Like, I don't want to do the work. I don't want to do it for me.
So this might be kind of a really, really specific question, but Shadowy would like to know, is there a reason why you choose Maya over another program like Cinema 4D?
Not really. I mean, there's a bit of a story behind it, but I used to use 3ds Max, and I used it for many years. And then for work purposes, I took a job at Sledgehammer Games, and they were like, you have to use Maya. So I was like, okay, I will learn Maya, and I learned Maya, and there's certain things I really like about Maya. I like the viewport. Like, I always hated 3ds Max's viewport. And there's some other things I like about it. But basically, it gets the job done. I actually have some old work on my portfolio where I use Modo too. Like, I wanted to learn Modo, and I saw all of Torfrick's amazing work, and everyone else that was using Modo was doing just incredible things with it. So I was like, I got to learn this too, because what if I'm missing out on something, And so I learned that, and I kind of just went back to Maya. I think it's really great for environments. I think it gets the job done, basically, and I'm kind of just okay with that.
I guess the lesson here is really it doesn't really matter what tool you use as long as the end result looks good, right?
Yeah, exactly. From my perspective, try different things, because maybe something just will jive with you better than another thing. Like, I think 3ds Max is a great program, but now that I use Maya, I realize, hey, I'm probably just not really mentally cut out to use Max to its max.
Well, I mean, as somebody who's been using Macs since 2001, so getting close to 20 years
Oh
now,
my.
maybe I'm sure my age. Oh gosh, um, I think like a typical Macs user, I love having all the coordinates down at the bottom of my screen, so I know exactly where each
Right.
vert is without having to go through a bunch of different menus. It works for me, and I don't really care what tool other people use as long as it works for you. You get the job done and you do it the best you can.
Yeah,
It really
exactly.
should be.
Yeah, and the other thing to remember is I'm pretty sure like every modeling tool literally does that the same thing that every other modeling tool does. Like you can find out how to do it in your program of choice, you know. So it's really just preference, you know. It's not really one program's better than another. It's just what do you work better with.
Yeah, and it really comes down to how you think and work, and that even really comes down to the game engines and whatnot that you work with too. It takes a type of artist to work with Unreal over Unity. You have to
Mm-hmm.
enjoy creating your own shaders. You have to enjoy getting into the guts of the engine to understand what each particular node in the material does. Because I kind of liken what is it Unity versus Unreal, sort of like the difference between people who use Macintosh and PCs, right? Um,
Right. Yeah.
like I would consider, and this is just my personal opinion, so don't tear me up too much, but I consider Unity me more like a Macintosh, where it just kind of functions right out of the box, and it's pretty easy to work with, and it's the kind of thing that you would give anybody to work with, and they could just get right up to speed with it.
Mm-hmm.
Unreal is an entirely different beast. It's very much like Android in the sense that if you want to get the most out of it, you have to dig into it. You have to know how the code works. You have to know how these things interact with one another. You can't just apply a couple of basic materials and hope for the best. You're never going to get the most out of it.
Totally agree. Totally agree. It requires a lot of research, a lot of like just figuring stuff out, and I can tell you, lighting is a big deal, and I'm really happy that Epic finally implemented physically accurate lighting because with all of the years that we've had PBR, we were missing physically accurate lighting, and it was just sort of like, well, PBR is nice and all, but if we don't know what our light units are, what's the point almost? So now that we have that, it's really easy to actually get to a point where you have all your lighting to be physically accurate and all your materials look right, and then you can start going in and being like, okay, now I want to make this light a bit more intense, or I want to change these properties. And starting from that physically accurate state just allows everything to be so much easier, and just you don't have to do nearly as much experimenting to get things in a state that you can be happy with.
Definitely. And I look at PBR like a solid foundation to work from. It's the concrete slab that sits underneath the building you're in. It is
Mm-hmm.
not the house that you build. Okay, so when you're, and this is going to probably be where we need to wrap up, so I'll make this quick.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said, PBR is the foundation you're sitting on. The house that you build is the art you create with it. You can build anything you want out of that. I mean, look at Fortnite, that runs on Unreal Engine, and that doesn't look physically accurate in the slightest, but it's
Yeah.
built on those same principles. It's a gorgeous game for what it is. So it really, like everything you're seeing in front of you, the way Jack worked, the way he created the scene, the way he built this stuff and showed you how to do it, it all comes down to your artistic eye and your ability to put these things together, and using PBR as a foundation from which you can then build anything that you want to create. Really, your imagination is the only limit here. Um, so hey Jack, I wanted to say thanks for hosting this live stream with me. It's great having you guys, anybody, to work with on these amazing adventures that we go on, just showcasing all this beautiful work we create here at Quixel. We need to wrap up. It's been about an hour, including the
Mm-hmm.
10 minutes of technical issues we had in the beginning. We're so sorry about that. Sometimes these things just happen. We do
Mm-hmm.
our best to minimize them. Any final thoughts you have?
Yeah, no, thank you all for coming to watch my first live stream. Yeah, I've had a great time talking about all this stuff, and stick around for more.
Great. Next week, as you saw in that teaser that Jack showed, we're going to have some amazing work from Victor to demonstrate. So look forward to that. I will be back next week to show off even more work that I didn't make, but our artist did. So thanks for showing up, everybody. We absolutely love having you. And hey, see you next time.